Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I build pictures of places nobody can stand in. That's the work described accurately, the version that means something to people who understand what photogrammetric reconstruction actually involves, rather than the version I give at dinner parties, which is that I make 3D models of shipwrecks. Both are true. The second one is easier to say. I'm a deep-sea photogrammetry specialist for a marine heritage consultancy. My job is to take thousands of individual frames of ROV footage collected across multiple expeditions and stitch them into composite three-dimensional models of underwater sites with enough precision that researchers and engineers can take measurements from the model they trust, the same way they trust measurements taken in the field. The work is methodical and exacting in the specific way of anything where errors in the input data propagate through every downstream use of the output. I build pictures of inaccessible places and people rely on the pictures, so the pictures have to be right. I've been doing this for 11 years across dozens of sites. I know what the data looks like when it's telling me something real, and I know what it looks like when it's telling me something that turns out to be a processing artifact or a lighting anomaly or the particular way a specific ROV's camera system introduces distortion at depth. The difference between real and artifact is something you develop a feel for across enough datasets. And I have enough datasets that my feel for it is reliable. The feature northeast of the Titanic's bow was real. I was certain of that before I finished the first week of analysis, and I've been more certain with every week of work since. The commission came from a documentary production company with serious resources and serious intentions for the project. They had acquired access to footage from every major Titanic expedition, from the 1986 First Contact Survey through the most recent 2023 dives, across 7 distinct expeditions conducted by 4 different organizations with different equipment and different objectives. They wanted a single definitive photogrammetric model of the bow section, the most comprehensive 3-dimensional documentation of the site ever assembled, produced to a standard that would be usable for research as well as documentary production. It was the kind of commission I don't turn down. The dataset alone was extraordinary. 11 years of footage from the most documented deep-sea wreck in history, and the technical challenge of aligning datasets from expeditions conducted 30 years apart with different navigation precision was exactly the kind of problem I find genuinely interesting to solve. I started with the 1986 footage, which is the earliest and the most technically limiting, and worked forward chronologically, building the model incrementally and registering each subsequent expedition's data against the growing composite. This is the correct method. You establish your earliest baseline and you build towards the present, because each successive dataset is higher resolution and more navigationally precise than the last, and working in that direction means you're always improving the model rather than degrading it. I was 3 weeks into the build, working through the 1991 expedition footage, when my alignment software flagged a consistent element in the sediment approximately 35 meters northeast of the bow. Consistent elements in a multi-expedition alignment are features that appear across datasets in the same position, which is how the software distinguishes persistent site features from single-frame debris or biological activity. Wreck debris, geological formations, the sediment mound structures that form around biological activity at depth. All of these produce consistent elements in the alignment. The software tags them for review, and I work through the tags, assign each one a classification, and build the feature catalog that accompanies the final model. I tagged the northeast feature for individual review and kept building. The individual review took a week longer than I anticipated because the feature's behavior across the datasets was not consistent with any of the classification categories I was assigning to other elements in the same pass, in any single frame, from any single expedition. The feature looked like an unremarkable sediment surface irregularity, the kind of thing an ROV operator passes over on the way to the documented features without stopping, because stopping for every sediment irregularity in a deep-sea survey would mean never reaching the wreck. None of the expedition reports in my reference archive mentioned it. None of the documented survey passes had specifically targeted it or noted it as significant. It was in the footage of every expedition that had covered that area of the site, visible in the background of frames where the bow section was the subject, and nobody had looked at it as a subject in its own right. The photogrammetric composite across all available datasets showed something different from what any individual frame suggested. The feature's form, when measured across the composite, was inconsistent with the sediment mound formations that deep-sea environments produce through biological activity and current deposition. Those formations are gradual and irregular, their profiles shaped by the accumulation processes that build them over time. This feature had a profile that my software kept attempting to classify as structural before defaulting to unclassified, which is what the software does when the measurements don't match any formation type in its reference library. Too consistent, too defined at the edges. The measurements produced numbers that were larger than any single frame suggested, because individual frames captured only partial views, and it was the composite that showed the full extent. I measured it 3 ways using different reference points on the bow section to verify I wasn't introducing systematic error through my choice of registration anchors. The measurements were consistent across all 3 approaches. I noted the measurements in my project file and spent 2 days thinking about what formation process would produce them before I went looking for the acoustic data. Several of the expeditions in my commission archive had collected sonar data alongside their visual footage. Sonar return profiles tell you about the density and surface properties of what the acoustic signal is bouncing off, which is different information from what visual footage provides and which doesn't depend on lighting conditions or camera geometry. I pulled the sonar data from the expeditions that had it and isolated the return profile for the feature's location. The return was inconsistent with the surrounding sediment. Deep Atlantic sediment at 3,800 meters has a specific sonar return signature that sediment scientists know well: soft and absorptive, the acoustic signal returning with characteristics that reflect the sediment's composition. The feature's return profile was denser and more reflective than the surrounding sediment. Different physical properties. Whatever was at that location was not sediment on top of sediment. It was something else, something with physical characteristics that produced a different acoustic response than the seabed it was resting on. I sent the photogrammetric measurements and the sonar return profile to Dr. Vance, a deep-sea sediment specialist at an oceanographic research institution who's published work on sediment formation processes at deep Atlantic sites I'd cited in 2 previous project reports. I sent the data without the specific site context, which is my standard practice when I want an unbiased assessment, and asked her to characterize the formation type. Her email came back within 2 days. She said it wasn't a sediment formation. The sonar return profile was inconsistent with any natural sediment feature type she could identify from the data I'd sent her, and the photogrammetric profile shared none of the characteristics of biogenic mound formation at deep Atlantic depths. She said she'd need to know the site to say anything more specific, and she asked where the data was from. I told her. She was quiet for 2 days before she replied. The reply was shorter than her initial response, and it asked one question. How long had the feature been present in the expedition footage record? I went back to the positional data to find out. Position tracking across a multi-expedition dataset from a site as extensively documented as the Titanic is technically manageable because the bow section itself provides stable reference points, structural features, with known positions that I can use to calibrate the positional accuracy of each expedition's navigation data against a consistent reference frame. The technique removes the navigation imprecision that would otherwise make fine positional measurements across expeditions unreliable. I mapped the feature's position in each expedition dataset where it appeared, using the bow's fixed reference points to bring every dataset into the same positional frame. The feature had moved. I want to be precise about the scale of the movement because the precision matters here. The total positional shift across the full 1986 to 2023 dataset was not hundreds of meters. It wasn't tens of meters. Across 37 years of documented position data, the feature had moved approximately 23 meters from a position roughly 35 meters northeast of the bow section in the 1986 footage to a position approximately 12 meters northeast of the bow in the 2023 footage. 23 meters in 37 years is not fast. It is approximately 60 centimeters per year. It is the kind of movement that is invisible in any individual expedition's data. Invisible in any comparison between consecutive expeditions. Visible only when you have the full dataset assembled with positional calibration precise enough to measure sub-meter shifts against a stable reference. The movement was directional. Every positional measurement I took across every expedition in sequence showed the feature closer to the bow than in the previous dataset. The direction was consistent. The rate was consistent. Toward the bow at approximately 60 centimeters per year for 37 years of documented position data. I sat with the calculation for the rest of that day and through the following morning before I called Dr. Vance. She answered on the second ring, which suggested she'd been expecting the call. I told her about the positional data. I told her the movement rate and the direction and the total displacement across the dataset. I told her The feature had been present in every expedition dataset from 1986 through 2023 and had been measurably closer to the bow in each successive expedition. She asked about the 1985 discovery footage. The initial discovery dive, conducted by the Ballard expedition, was not part of my commission archive. I had reference photographs from it, but not the full footage. I told her the initial discovery pass coverage of the bow area was incomplete, and the feature's location fell in a gap in that coverage. She asked whether I had done the backward extrapolation. I had. I'd done it the previous afternoon, and I was still deciding what to think about it. The backward extrapolation takes the consistent movement rate and projects it backward from the 1986 baseline position at 60 centimeters per year, backward from 35 meters in 1986. The feature would have been approximately 38 meters from the bow in 1985 during the discovery expedition. Further back, in 1950, it would have been approximately 55 meters from the bow. In 1912, when the Titanic sank and came to rest at 3,800 meters, the extrapolation places the feature's position at approximately 74 meters northeast of the bow. 74 meters from a wreck that didn't exist yet. I told Dr. Vance the extrapolated 1912 position. She said, "So it was already there when the Titanic arrived." I said that was what the extrapolation suggested, with the caveat that extrapolation from a 37-year dataset carries uncertainty that increases as you extend it backward, and the 1912 position was an extrapolation across more than a century from data that only starts in 1986. She said, "But the direction and rate are consistent across the full 37 years you have." I said yes, they were. She said she didn't have a natural process that would account for it, and she'd been in deep-sea sediment science for 23 years. We ended the call, and I opened the backward extrapolation calculation and looked at it for a long time. The Titanic sank on the 15th of April, 1912. It sat at the bottom of the North Atlantic for 73 years before Robert Ballard's expedition located it in September 1985. 73 years at 3,800 meters depth, in water that stays at approximately 2 degrees above freezing, in complete darkness, except for the bioluminescent activity of the organisms that live at that depth. No cameras, no sonar, no documentation of any kind. A wreck that the world knew was somewhere in the North Atlantic and couldn't find for 3/4 of a century. Whatever is northeast of the bow appears in every documented dataset from the first expedition that filmed the area in 1986. It has been moving toward the bow at a consistent rate for the full 37 years of footage history I have. The backward extrapolation puts it outside the debris field, at some distance from the bow, before the first expedition arrived, before 1985, before the discovery, before anyone knew where the Titanic was. The 73 undocumented years sit in the middle of this, and I have nothing to put in them. I don't know what the feature was doing during those years. I don't know how long it had been at that location before the discovery. I don't know if it was already moving at the same rate in 1912, which the backward extrapolation assumes, or whether it arrived at some point during the 73 years, or whether the rate has varied across a timeline longer than my dataset covers. What I know is what the data shows, which is 37 years of consistent movement in one direction at one rate toward one destination, and a sonar return profile that 2 decades of deep-sea sediment science can't classify as any natural formation type. My report to the production company documents the feature as an unclassified acoustic and photogrammetric anomaly in the sediment northeast of the bow section. The position data across expedition years is included as an appendix. The calculated movement rate is included. Dr. Vance's assessment that the sonar return is inconsistent with natural sediment formation is cited. I recommend specialist investigation of the feature's acoustic and photogrammetric profile before the site is considered comprehensively documented. The report is accurate. The backward extrapolation is not in it, because the backward extrapolation is a projection with significant uncertainty from a dataset that starts in 1986, and a professional report for a documentary production company is not the place to publish a speculative positional history for an unclassified anomaly at an iconic heritage site. The uncertainty caveat would be appropriate. The context in which the number would be received would not. The backward extrapolation is in my personal project notes. The calculation is correct within the uncertainty margins I've specified. I've checked it 4 times. I think about the production company's model, which is the most comprehensive photogrammetric documentation of the Titanic bow section ever assembled, precise to a standard that previous expedition models didn't approach. I think about all of the researchers and documentary makers and heritage professionals who will use it, who will measure deck fittings and structural deformation and debris distribution with a confidence the data supports. The feature is in the model. It's tagged as unclassified in the feature catalog. Someone will eventually look at the tag and read the report recommendation and decide whether to pursue the specialist investigation. That decision is not mine. What is mine is the calculation and what the calculation says, which is that something has been in the sediment northeast of the Titanic's bow for the full 37 years anyone has been looking, has been moving toward the bow at a rate so slow that 40 years of expeditions looked past it on their way to the wreck, and was in the North Atlantic at a location outside the debris field before the first expedition arrived to document the site. 37 years of directional, consistent, measurable movement towards the bow section of the most famous shipwreck in the world, from a feature that has no natural formation explanation in an area that everyone photographs while passing through and nobody has stopped to examine. 60 centimeters per year doesn't feel like much. Across 37 years, it produces 23 meters of documented displacement. Across the remaining 12 meters between the feature's 2023 position and the bow section, at the same rate, it produces a calculation I've done and set aside and come back to and set aside again. I know what the number is. I've decided not to write it down. The model is delivered. The report is filed. I've moved to the next commission, which is a 19th century merchant vessel in the Mediterranean. Straightforward documentation work. Nothing in the dataset that my alignment software has flagged as requiring individual review. I do the work carefully, the way I always do it. I build the picture from the individual frames and I look at what the assembled whole shows that no single frame contains. I don't go back to the Titanic dataset. I know what's in it. I know what the number at the end of the calculation is. The feature is 12 meters from the bow,